So South Africa finally has a UFC champion. It's Dricus du Plessis in what was an extraordinarily close fight with Sean Strickland. Ultimately, the result was a split decision victory. 48-47 was the score on all three judges' cards, but two of the three had it scored for DDP. I want to get into the X's and O's of how the fight went because I think it went a little bit differently than we all had thought it was going to go, and also talk about the decision. Was this a robbery? Was it the right call? Should Sean have gotten his hand raised? So there's a lot to unpack there, but what are your initial thoughts?
Well, the way you have to look at a robbery is if you watch a fight, go the entire duration and you're like, okay, we clearly know who won that fight, and then that person doesn't get their hand raised, that's a robbery.
Right.
But at the end of this 5 rounds, I was like, you know what? I think after just seeing what happened and not really having all the stats right in front of my face, but seeing what they have when they pop up on the screen, I was like, I'm pretty sure Sean won 3 of the rounds. He definitely won the first one. He definitely won the 5th one. And I had him winning the 2nd round. But I can see a case for DDP. And I certainly think DDP looked really good in the rounds that he won. And he certainly put a statement down on rounds 3 and 4, in my opinion. So you have to not consider it a robbery every time somebody loses and it seems a little bit unexpected, or it seems like maybe a mixed variety of what people think the results should be. DDP went out there and fought his heart out, and he had a really good game plan. He pushed the pace. In a lot of instances, he dictated the pace and where the fight took place. But Sean Strickland was doing a lot of things right, and just because Sean has a certain style that maybe doesn't lend to him getting the judges to favor him in certain rounds or certain situations doesn't mean he's not actually controlling the fight or winning the fight. It's a very interesting thing. But all in all, I think it was a really great fight, and it's one of those ones I personally would like to see an immediate rematch for.
Yeah, there certainly is a case for that. When the champion loses an extraordinarily close fight, generally they get the rematch. Now, 185 has some really interesting players and moving pieces, so we'll see what ends up happening and what fight they ultimately make. There's an MMA YouTube channel called The Weasel, and he did a breakdown that I watched this morning, and I went back and watched the fight again as well. I was like you. I thought Sean Strickland won the fight 48-47 because I gave him rounds 1, 2, and 5. Then when I went back and watched the fight, I was like, you know what? Round 2 was a little bit closer than I had originally thought that it was. And after watching the Weasel's breakdown, I do think that DDP, by the way judging is supposed to be done, did win rounds 2 and 3. And obviously round 4 was DDP's sort of biggest round. That was his real statement round. So after seeing the fight again and watching that recap, I did change my opinion a little bit. I think the right person did get their hand raised, although it was very close. Look, if you come out and tell me Sean Strickland won 48-47 or DDP won 48-47, I'm not going to look at you sideways regardless of who you think should have gotten their hand raised, because that was a razor-thin decision. But it really brings into question, because one thing that the Weasel talked about a lot in his breakdown was the significant strikes. And he scored the heavy body kicks for DDP higher than the jabs for Sean Strickland. And I think that's something that's worth diving into and exploring, because Dricus du Plessis, his face told the story after the fight. He was very beaten up by the jab of Sean Strickland. And while jabs traditionally are not really considered to be a significant damaging strike, when you listen to what DDP said, and it was, I felt like somebody was throwing rocks at my face every time he was landing that jab. It was landing very hard. It was snapping my head back. I think we have to at least bring into the conversation the fact that if somebody's throwing a really heavy, stiff jab that's doing damage, that's causing swelling, that's making your opponent bleed, that should probably be skewed on somewhat of an equal playing field as a heavy body kick or a heavy leg kick, because I think it is a damaging strike and it is quote-unquote significant at the end of the day.
Well, that's a great point, and you're exactly right. Sean Strickland throws a lot of jabs, and he does a lot of damage with his jabs, but according to the rules, a jab is considered an insignificant strike, and even though he's doing more damage with his jab than DDP was doing with his heavy hands, or even than Sean was doing with his own kicks and heavy-handed punches, he was still getting judged for insignificant strikes. And I think you have to sort of look at that and say, if the insignificant strikes that he's throwing are doing the most damage, and damage is looked at as the most important thing when it comes to actually judging a fight and deciding who wins if the fight doesn't get finished within the duration, you have to start to scratch your head and say, okay, well, we have to maybe abandon this insignificant strike when it's coming from a jab, and just say all strikes are significant, and then you kind of have a wash there. Because if you're going to have somebody kicking the leg and that's considered a significant strike, or kicking the body, and half the time they're getting blocked by arms, or they're just hitting bones and not doing a lot of damage, but they're considered significant strikes. And a jab is shutting somebody's eye. The guy himself is saying that it felt like somebody was throwing rocks at my face. That has to be considered a significant strike, but on paper and in theory, it's not. So I don't know. It's a very confusing thing. Obviously, we're not going to fix MMA judging in a night. We're not going to have one fight like this that was ultra competitive and really close, that really, in my opinion, wasn't a robbery, be the fight, be the one example where we have to change everything, right? There's been way worse robberies, if you will, in the past several years even. And Sean Strickland, while I think he did enough to get his hand raised and he did enough to win that fight, probably shouldn't be hanging his head, or shouldn't feel like the world is against him and he got robbed, because it was a very close fight. And I'm sure as soon as the final bell rung, he wasn't 100% certain he had that fight. I think he had a good idea that he won the last round, the first round, and probably stole one of those middle rounds. But at the end of the day, if you leave it up to the judges, you never know what they're going to do. If you go to a place like Canada that hasn't had MMA fights over there at the highest level in many years, you just don't know what you're going to do. You don't want to leave your destiny in the hands of three random strangers.
Well, that's very well said. And that's the thing for Sean that's tough, right? Because when he gets in there with a heavy-handed fighter, he's going to do work doing what he does, which is throwing that jab and landing with pinpoint accuracy.
Right.
But a lot of times he kind of suffers for it on the judge's scorecard unless he really puts on a clinic like he did against Izzy. But when it's close, Sean seems to be on the wrong end of some of these split decision losses. And last night was no different. Now, I want to talk about something Dana White said at the post-fight press conference that I don't necessarily agree with, but I think I'm kind of on my own in this sense, and a lot of people do agree with what he said, which is that in order to beat the champion, you got to take it to the champion. Mm-hmm. And I think that fights just need to be scored by the 5 or 3 or however many rounds that they are, and the winner should be crowned the winner. I don't think somebody should have to do more than the other person because they hold a specific thing or they have a specific ranking. I believe that the slate should be wiped clean as soon as that bell rings. Nobody's the champion, and we're going to do 5 rounds or less to decide who is the champion. So I don't necessarily agree with the sentiment that you gotta take it to the champion to win the fight. I think you just got to win more rounds than the champion wins. But the other thing are the takedowns. Mm-hmm. That was, something else that was sort of the X factor for DDP. He got, I think, 5 for 7 takedowns. Yep. No significant progress or damage done when those takedowns took place. And Sean showed us that he's got just as good of wrestling defense and the ability to stand up as we all kind of thought that he had. He just never really had the reason or wasn't the right circumstance to show it. But he showed last night how good his wrestling defense is. And so that makes me kind of bring into question, how heavily should those takedowns be scored when the opponent gets up immediately and no damage is done?
Yeah, we're talking about significance here. And I think that wrestling is a very significant aspect of fighting. And taking somebody down should be seen as significant, but only if you're able to keep them there. And I think it was 5 of 7 when they showed the statistic, but he did shoot a couple more times, and Sean was able to defend
at the
those.
End there.
So it ended up being, I think, 5 out of 9, which is still very impressive. You get the champion down 5 times, it's ultra impressive, but he didn't do anything with him. And that's where another issue I have with the MMA judging, and I'm not one of those people that's like just annoyed by it, or I don't let it ruin my viewing experience. But we have to understand, if somebody is, their game plan is to take you to the ground and they do it and they're only holding you there for a half a second, or you're able to get yourself right back up. I feel like we should look at it as, okay, this guy had a plan. He has a skill set and he's trying to utilize it, and the other guy was able to defend it. That should be significant.
Right.
The fact that he was able to, like, if you can go in there against Khabib and not get taken down or stop all his takedowns, or when he gets you down, you get right back up, he shouldn't score and get credit for those takedowns like you got credit, like you should get credit for stopping them or negating them.
Yeah, it should be a wash almost.
Right. It should go back to even Steven. And I think DDP's timing on his takedowns were really great. It showed when he shot in that first time, it was as clean as you can get. His hands clasped right under the butt. It was as clean of an entry as you could possibly ask for. And I was like, okay, if he's able to do this every round, there's going to be some trouble for Sean Strickland, because Sean's not the kind of guy to one-punch KO anybody. He's kind of waiting. He's got a great style for 5 rounds. But it does take an accumulation for him to get these big 185ers out of there. And DDP is just so durable. And if he's able to take the fight to the ground halfway through the round, you're really talking about 2.5 minutes to really work if he's able to hold you down. Now, Sean was able to get back to his feet. They were both expending a lot of energy in those takedown exchanges because while Sean was working hard to get himself back up, DDP was working like hell to keep him on the ground. And we even saw on that first or second takedown, once he realized Sean was building up his base and working back up to his feet, that DDP actually disengaged and just completely let go, and they went back into the striking realm. So that was interesting to see. I think DDP had a really good game plan. And that other point you made about Dana White saying you have to take it to the champion or you have to go steal the belt from him. It's a primal instinct. It's something that's in our DNA where we're like, okay, think about old times where there was kings. And if you want to take that king's throne, you got to go kill the king, right?
Right.
Now, we don't have to go that extreme, but I honestly do feel like DDP went in there and took it to the champion. He dictated where the fight went. And I know Sean Strickland kind of has a Floyd Mayweather style where he's going to move around and he's going to utilize every inch of the octagon that he can and jab and just beat you up and make his defense win him some fights and then, make you miss a bunch and then score and counter. And he does that very well. But Floyd Mayweather also was able to pick who judged his fights. He was also able to figure out how he can win fights doing a very defensive style of fighting. And Sean Strickland doesn't have that same luxury. He's not putting on the show. He's not paying the judges and all that. So he has to be very cautious when he's going in with that game plan because while I think it's a great game plan, it's a great fighting style, if it's not going to get your hand raised and you have to be the aggressor like DDP was and take it to the champ, so to speak, then you're talking about something that really should change everybody's outlook on how they should approach a fight. But it's a slippery slope. If jabs aren't considered a significant strike, that means they're considered insignificant. And that means you should probably take them out of your arsenal. Don't throw as many jabs, even though that might be your best weapon, like in Sean Strickland's case it is. I think that DDP came out there, he was throwing heavy leather. He was trying to get the fight where he wanted it. Sean Strickland's very hard to fight on the feet. He's even harder to keep down on the ground. And I think DDP did enough to get his hand raised, but it was a very close fight, very controversial, and I'd like to see a rematch because when you see 25 minutes and it's that competitive all the way through, it leaves you with some questions and you want some answers, and I think another 5 rounds is what we need.
I agree.